Here are slides on the causes of the American Revolution. Two main causes were the French and Indian War, which then led to the taxes and acts being passed by Parliament.
So this is our timeline. We wanted to start off talking about the French and Indian War, which happened from 1756 to 1763, and we'll end talking about the Intolerable Act, which is 1774. We also left in the start of the Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, and the end of the Revolution, just to give you a visual idea of when all of these happened. The French and Indian War was also known as the 7 Years' War because it lasted for the 7 years between 1756 to 1763. Many countries fought for the control over land. For example, in the map, you can see that the Americas, Asia, Europe, they all fought in this war, but it was mainly against Britain and France. In the end, Britain gained most of the land, but this was at a high price and a large toll on the economy because it left them in debt, and they needed to gain back their strength. So these were one of the factors that led up to the revolution, because Parliament wanted to tax the colonies to receive profit to recover, and the colonies to them seemed the easiest way to gain through their losses.
The next thing we're going to talk about is the Sugar Act and the Currency Act, which happened in 1764.
So the Sugar and Currency Act, like just said, was in 1764, but the Sugar Act was April 5th, and this was where the colonists had to pay taxes on their molasses by the gallon. And so this was for the importation of the molasses. And this actually ended up hurting the British economy because the colonists saw a way around it. They started using French molasses instead, and Parliament had to make adjustments to reduce the tax price so that they could get their tax back. But instead of just leaving it at that, the list of tax goods became larger, and this evolved into the Currency Act. And this hurt the colonists' economy because prior the colonists had a shortage of currency, and they relied on currency a lot for trade. But this basically passed an act where colonists had to restrict the paper money. It prohibited any other money which wasn't the existing currency that Britain used. And the colonies suffered greatly and ended up protesting, which led to more taxes, which then led to unrest that did eventually lead to the revolution.
The next event was the Stamp Act, which happened in 1765.
So what is the Stamp Act? The Stamp Act was a tax on paper, and the colonists had already felt that they weren't in control of their own legislation because their rights were being violated and they weren't being given what they should as a natural right. And the colonists were against taxes because of the previous taxes, and so they were basically against the Stamp Act before it was even implemented. So in March 22nd, 1764, when it was passed to be initiated in November, the colonists were enraged, and Parliament was not consulting with the colonies before implementing. And this led to somebody called Patrick Henry, and he was very vocal about his views. The colonists had the same rights as people in England, and this involved taxes. And so he wrote something called the Stamp Act Resolves that sent to Parliament, which is basically the British government. So after the colonists realised that they could unite to make an impact, they started protesting. They made satirical drawings, the act of defiance. And so government realised it was a mistake and they removed the Stamp Act, even though the impact was still left. So in 1773, there was another act, the Tea Act, and that was met with more unrest and more protests.
So tea was already being taxed as part of the Townshend Revenue Act of 1767, but everything was repealed except for the tea. The Tea Act was passed on April 27th of 1773. It was intended to bail the British East India Company tea out of debt, and this granted the BEIC a monopoly on all tea sales and allowed them to export to America. Now they were able to sell over 17 million pounds of surplus tea, which they were before only able to sell at auctions in London.
So this infected the Boston Tea Party, which is the next thing we'll be talking about. That's also in 1773 because it was much closer to the Tea Act than any of the other protests were.
So the Boston Tea Party happened in December 16th of 1773. A group of Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded the three ships, the Beaver, Dartmouth, and Eleanor. They destroyed over 92,000 pounds of tea, or 340 chests of British East India Company tea, which they dumped into the Boston Harbor. The cause of all of this was that the colonists refused the unloading of the tea from a ship that came from England, but the lieutenant governor and chief justice refused to return the ships. So the colonists got mad and started rioting.
Yes, so the impact was this. This was one of the first times the colonists united against Britain in a destructive act. So next we have the Intolerable Acts, and those are also known as the Coercive Acts of 1774.
So after the Boston Tea Party, the Parliament came up with the 5 Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts. The first act was the Boston Port Act, which closed the Boston port until the British East India Company tea was able to pay for all the lost tea, and this hurt a lot of people who depended on trade. Another act was the Massachusetts Government Act, which took away many rights of self-government and punished Boston to try to force it out of resistance. A third act was the Administration of Justice Act. British officials accused of committing crimes could be taken to England for trial, which England tried to help British officials escape justice. Another act was the Quartering Act, which allowed colonists to quarter British soldiers in the colonists' houses and buildings. And all of this was done at the colonists' expense, which means that the British soldiers were able to stay at colonists' house and not pay anything. The last act was the Quebec Act, which extended the boundaries of Quebec to give them more representation. Colonists felt that all of this violated their natural rights, so they protested against all of this to start the American Revolution.
Yeah, the protests were basically where the colonists found that they could unite together to impact the British, and that led to political unrest, which obviously led to calls for justice and the revolution.